Have you ever found yourself caught in that maddening dance with someone who seems to want you desperately one moment, only to vanish like morning mist the next? Did you ever wonder if that person who's been keeping you at arm's length might actually be ready to let you in? Today, we're going to explore the profound mystery of how to tell if an avoidant is finally ready to commit. And I promise you, the signs are far more subtle and fascinating than you might imagine. You see, I've spent considerable time observing the human condition, particularly the intricate ways we protect ourselves from the very thing we crave most: genuine connection. The avoidant individual is perhaps one of the most misunderstood characters in the grand theater of love. They're not cold-hearted monsters, as popular psychology might suggest. Rather, they're often the most sensitive souls among us, who learned early that caring too much, hoping too much, trusting too much leads to devastating disappointment. So they developed what I call the fortress strategy. Build the walls high enough, thick enough, and maybe, just maybe, you won't get hurt again. But here's what makes this entire subject so compelling. Even the most steadfast fortress has its moments of vulnerability, its cracks in the foundation where light begins to seep through. When an avoidant person begins to truly consider commitment, it's not a dramatic Hollywood transformation. It's more like watching a master painter slowly, carefully add layers to a canvas, each stroke deliberate, each color chosen with painstaking precision. The change is subtle, nuanced, and requires a trained eye to recognize. Now, you might be thinking, why should I care about this? Why not just find someone who's emotionally available from the start? A perfectly reasonable question, and one I've pondered myself. The answer lies in understanding that sometimes the most profound connections occur when two people meet each other's needs in ways they never expected. Perhaps you're someone who thrives on independence but secretly yearns for a love that doesn't suffocate. Perhaps you're attracted to depth, complexity, and the kind of emotional intelligence that comes from having wrestled with one's own demons and emerged wiser for it. The avoidant individual, when they finally decide to commit, doesn't do so lightly. They've run the calculations, weighed the risks, and made a conscious choice that this person, this relationship, is worth the terrifying prospect of vulnerability. When that happens, you're not getting someone who's settling or following societal expectations. You're getting someone who has chosen you with the same careful consideration a curator gives to acquiring a masterpiece for their collection. Throughout our time together today, I'll share with you the subtle art of recognition, how to distinguish between someone who's merely having a moment of weakness and someone who's genuinely evolving. We'll explore the psychological concepts of illusion of validity and anchoring, which play crucial roles in how avoidant individuals make decisions about commitment. More importantly, I'll give you practical, actionable insights that will help you navigate this complex terrain with wisdom rather than wishful thinking. The stakes, my dear viewer, are higher than you might realize. Misreading these signs can lead to months or even years of emotional limbo, where you're investing in potential rather than reality. But correctly identifying when an avoidant is truly ready to commit, that's the beginning of something extraordinary, something worth waiting for. Let me tell you about Marcus, a brilliant architect I once knew who could design breathtaking spaces for others to call home, but couldn't seem to create one for himself. Marcus had perfected the art of romantic reconnaissance. He would study potential partners like blueprints, identifying every possible structural weakness, every point where the foundation might crack under pressure. He'd been hurt profoundly in his early 20s by someone he'd trusted completely, and the betrayal had left him convinced that love was simply a poorly constructed building waiting to collapse. For years, Marcus dated with the efficiency of a building inspector. He'd meet wonderful women, enjoy their company, but the moment they began to speak of futures and forevers, he'd find fatal flaws in the relationship's architecture. "She's too dependent," he'd say of one. "She doesn't understand my need for space," he'd declare about another. Always something, always a reason to maintain his carefully constructed distance. Then he met Sarah, a landscape designer with an unusual quality. She seemed to understand that some of the most beautiful gardens require patient cultivation. She didn't push Marcus for definitions or timelines. Instead, she created space for their connection to grow organically. But here's what made their story fascinating. Marcus began to change in ways so subtle that he himself didn't recognize them at first. The first sign came during a dinner conversation about their respective childhoods. Marcus, who typically deflected personal questions with the skill of a seasoned diplomat, found himself telling Sarah about his father's sudden death when he was 12, and how his mother had retreated into her own grief, leaving him to navigate adolescence feeling essentially orphaned by both loss and abandonment. He shared this not because Sarah had pried or manipulated, but because something about her steady presence made vulnerability feel less dangerous. Sarah listened without trying to fix or analyze, without offering platitudes about everything happening for a reason. She simply witnessed his story, and in that witnessing, Marcus experienced something he hadn't felt since childhood, the safety of being truly seen without judgment. This wasn't the dramatic emotional breakdown you might expect from a movie scene. It was quieter, more profound, like a door that had been locked for decades finally clicking open. The second transformation occurred during what Marcus later described as the weekend that changed everything. Sarah had been offered a 6-month landscape design project in another city, a career opportunity she'd been working toward for years. Marcus expected to feel relief at this natural exit ramp from their relationship. Instead, he felt something that terrified him, genuine loss at the thought of her absence. Not just the loss of companionship or convenience, but the specific, irreplaceable loss of Sarah herself. That night, lying in his perfectly organized apartment that suddenly felt sterile and empty, Marcus experienced what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable tension between his long-held belief that independence equaled safety and his growing realization that connection with Sarah felt more like home than solitude ever had. For the first time in his adult life, the risk of vulnerability seemed smaller than the risk of loss. The next morning, Marcus did something that surprised even him. Instead of his usual careful, measured communication style, he called Sarah and, with his voice actually trembling, asked if they could talk about what her leaving would mean for them. Not in his typical analytical way, but from a place of genuine, emotional investment. "I think," he said, pausing as if the words were foreign on his tongue, "I think I'd like to try building something real with you, even if I don't know exactly how." Sarah later told me that she knew in that moment that Marcus had crossed some internal threshold. It wasn't his words alone, though they mattered. It was the quality of his presence, the way he seemed fully there with her for the first time, not holding part of himself in reserve for a quick escape. She said it felt like he'd finally stopped treating their relationship like a temporary installation and started seeing it as something worth investing in for the long term. What happened next defied Marcus's every expectation. Instead of the suffocating loss of freedom he'd always feared commitment would bring, he found himself feeling more authentically himself than he had in years. The energy he'd spent maintaining emotional distance could now be channeled into building something meaningful. Sarah took the project, but structured it so she could return home every few weeks. And Marcus found himself not just missing her during her absences, but actively planning for their reunions, thinking about their shared future, even using the word "we" naturally in conversations about upcoming months and years. The most telling moment came 6 months later, when Sarah's project ended and she had to decide whether to pursue another opportunity abroad or return home permanently. Marcus, the man who had spent years avoiding any conversation about the future, found himself not just hoping she'd return, but actively advocating for their relationship, talking about the life they could build together, the home they could create. He'd moved from someone who treated love like a risk to be managed to someone who saw it as the most worthwhile investment he could make. Now, let me share with you the practical wisdom gleaned from observing transformations like Marcus's, because the signs that an avoidant is truly ready to commit are both subtle and significant, and knowing how to recognize them can save you years of uncertainty and emotional exhaustion. The first crucial indicator is what I call voluntary vulnerability, moments when they share personal information or feelings without being prompted, questioned, or cornered into it. This is fundamentally different from the defensive vulnerability that occurs during arguments or confrontations. When an avoidant spontaneously tells you about their childhood fear of abandonment, or mentions how much they missed you during a brief separation, or admits to feeling nervous about something important to them, pay attention. They're not just sharing information. They're offering you access to their inner world, and for someone who's spent years guarding that world fiercely, this is monumentally significant. The second sign involves what psychologists call future-focused language. But here's where it gets interesting. You're not looking for grand declarations or dramatic promises about forever. Instead, listen for casual assumptions about shared future experiences. When they start saying things like, "Next summer we should visit that place you mentioned," or "When we get a place together, we'll need more storage," or even, "I was thinking about what you said about wanting children," they're unconsciously including you in their mental model of the future. This represents a fundamental shift from viewing the relationship as a series of present moments to seeing it as an ongoing narrative with chapters yet to be written. The third indicator is perhaps the most telling. Their relationship with uncertainty begins to change. Avoidant individuals typically hate uncertainty in emotional contexts because uncertainty means potential loss of control, potential hurt, potential abandonment. But when they're truly ready to commit, you'll notice them becoming more comfortable with not knowing exactly how everything will unfold. They'll express curiosity about growing together rather than fear about what that growth might mean. They might say things like, "I don't know exactly what this will look like, but I want to figure it out with you," words that would have terrified them earlier in the relationship. Now, here's where understanding the psychological concepts of illusion of validity and anchoring becomes crucial. The illusion of validity is our tendency to be overconfident in our judgments, especially when they're based on consistent patterns we've observed. In the context of avoidant behavior, you might anchor your expectations on their past patterns of emotional withdrawal and assume those patterns will continue indefinitely. This anchoring can blind you to genuine change when it occurs. For instance, if your avoidant partner has historically changed the subject every time you've mentioned meeting their family, you might anchor on that pattern and dismiss it when they casually mention that their sister would probably like you. The illusion of validity tells you that your judgment about their avoidance is reliable because it's been consistent, but people do evolve, and avoidant individuals, when they're truly ready to commit, often surprise themselves with their own capacity for openness. The key is learning to hold both truths simultaneously. Patterns matter and provide valuable information, but they're not immutable laws of physics. When evaluating whether an avoidant is ready to commit, you need to balance healthy skepticism born from past experience with openness to genuine transformation. This requires what I call detective-level observation, paying attention to changes in behavior while maintaining realistic expectations about the pace of that change. Another crucial aspect involves their relationship with your emotions and needs. Historically, avoidant individuals manage their fear of intimacy by minimizing or dismissing their partner's emotional needs. They might say things like, "You're being too sensitive," or "You're making this bigger than it needs to be." But when they're genuinely ready to commit, their response to your emotions becomes markedly different. Instead of minimizing, they start validating. Instead of dismissing, they start engaging. They might say something like, "I can see this really matters to you. Help me understand why." Or, "I know I haven't been great at this in the past, but I want to do better." This shift represents a fundamental change in how they view the relationship itself. Previously, your emotional needs might have felt like threats to their autonomy or reminders of their own vulnerability. Now, those same needs are viewed as important information about how to build a stronger partnership. They're no longer seeing your emotions as problems to be solved or minimized, but as integral parts of who you are and what makes the relationship work. The timeline aspect is equally important to understand. When an avoidant decides to commit, they don't typically announce it with fanfare. Instead, commitment reveals itself through gradual integration of lives and futures. They start including you in mundane decisions, not just where to go for vacation, but whether to renew their lease, what job opportunity to pursue, how to spend holidays. These everyday inclusions often matter more than grand romantic gestures because they indicate that you've become part of their default life equation rather than a separate entity they're managing alongside their real life. Pay attention to how they handle conflict differently. Avoidant individuals typically manage relationship conflicts through withdrawal, either physical or emotional. They might shut down, leave the room, or simply stop engaging until the storm passes. But when they're truly ready to commit, their approach to conflict undergoes a dramatic transformation. Instead of withdrawal, they start leaning in. They'll say things like, "I know I usually shut down when we fight, but I don't want to do that anymore." Or, "This is hard for me to talk about, but I think we need to work through this." This change in conflict management style is perhaps one of the most reliable indicators of genuine readiness for commitment because it requires them to override some of their deepest self-protection instincts. They're choosing the discomfort of working through problems together over the familiar comfort of emotional escape. Finally, observe their relationship with the concept of we versus I. Avoidant individuals typically maintain very clear boundaries between self and other, often talking about their lives, decisions, and futures in distinctly individual terms. When they're ready to commit, this linguistic pattern shifts in profound ways. They start naturally using collaborative language, talking about shared goals, joint decisions, and mutual responsibilities. This isn't performative or conscious. It's a genuine reflection of how they're beginning to see themselves as part of a team rather than as an individual who happens to be dating someone. Understanding these signs requires patience and wisdom because the transformation from avoidant to committed doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen in a straight line. There will be moments of regression, times when old patterns resurface, especially during periods of stress or uncertainty. The key is looking for the overall trajectory rather than judging the relationship based on any single interaction or difficult day. So there you have it. The subtle art of recognizing when someone who has spent years perfecting emotional distance is finally ready to close that gap and build something real with you. Like Marcus discovering that love could feel like coming home rather than losing himself, the avoidant individual's journey to commitment is one of the most profound transformations you'll ever witness. Remember, this isn't about changing someone or waiting indefinitely for potential to become reality. It's about recognizing authentic growth when it occurs and making informed decisions about your own emotional investment. The person who learns to love despite their fears, who chooses vulnerability despite their instincts, who commits despite their conditioning, that person is offering you something extraordinarily precious. If you're currently navigating this complex terrain with someone, take heart in knowing that genuine change is possible, that walls built in childhood can be dismantled in adulthood, and that sometimes the most meaningful connections are forged between people who understand that love is both a risk and a choice, made daily, consciously, courageously. Trust your observations, honor your own needs, and remember that the greatest love stories aren't about perfect people finding each other. They're about imperfect people choosing to grow together, one vulnerable moment at a time. The avoidant who finally commits isn't giving up their freedom. They're discovering that true freedom might just be found in choosing to stay, to build, to love without reservation. That, my dear viewer, is a transformation worth recognizing, worth waiting for, and worth celebrating when it finally beautifully arrives.
If you believe this video might help someone dear to you, share it with them. A small gesture on your part could mean the world to a friend in need.